Alrighty, good day, listeners. You are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today we have the return of Matthew Grant to cover some more Australian history. How you going, mate?
Yeah, good. It's good to be back on the hustle.
Yeah, it's certainly nice. I've got my mead here to help grease the wheels a little bit. Maybe
good.
Not the most Australian drink. I don't know if there's any law around that, but I think it's more the Anglo-Saxon blood memory, as a mate would say.
That's all right.
Been reading a little bit of Beowulf, and
it sounds cooler than the dandelion tea that I'm having. So all good.
Yeah, all right. So a bit of a new thing for the podcast, but we've got a couple of listener comments to go through from the last episode, so that's nice to see. And these are from Slogan22 is his username, and he writes, the ANA was formed in 1871 to 18 years before Mustache Man was born. To me, he's irrelevant. I'd much rather hear a discussion regarding the ideas of our founding fathers, Parkes, Deakin, Barton, etc., and why they were so motivated to maintain a white Australia and what their ideals were. What do you have to say to that, Grant?
Yeah, look, I say we really can't please everyone, because on the one hand, we stay on historical topics, and then people complain and say, well, you're just living in the past. You know, you need current events, current opinion, blah, 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 which is fair enough. And then when we talk about some kind of contemporary issues, kind of having a bit of a look at the ideological kind of issues relevant to NS versus nativism, which was in that last podcast, which I quite enjoyed listening to. Then we get punished for not talking about strictly Australian history. So I guess, yeah, we understand the sentiment. This podcast is really just it's pretty open book. Like, we'll talk about anything. The main objective really is that you're getting, the personal perspectives of different ANA people, and from a more of a nativist Australian lens, looking at any particular issue. But that's my point, I'd say, on it.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing another Australian history podcast today, so hopefully that listener will be a little happier with our topic today, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, but it is going to be the Rum Rebellion, picking up from where we left off in the last history one we did together. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to occasionally talk about the contemporary scene, and obviously, NS is a reasonably big part of that. But yeah, I mean, we don't need to be totally dominated by that issue, and we're not. We've only really done one show on it. But Slogan22 wrote as well on another point. When the British arrived in 1788, the Aborigines, in my opinion, hit the jackpot. We have nothing to apologise for, yet Thomas started off by apologising for things that are long in the past and, in my opinion, greatly exaggerated. Yeah, look, personally, speaking for myself, I kind of agree that the Aboriginals weren't too hard done by. I wouldn't say they had nothing to complain about. I mean, there were issues, but I mean, we did cover in that last podcast we did together things like, look, they would be attacking the settlers and stuff. And when it came to the diseases, there was obviously no intention to spread diseases to them, contrary to, myths that get spread by academics. Like the colony was kind of quite surprised to see that there wasn't going to be any outbreak, and they had no real idea of what the vector was for that. So yeah, look, there are a variety of opinions on the Aboriginal question in the ANA, but to my mind, as long as there are no like Aboriginal nationalists that are kind of like motivated by more than the general anti-white grievance industry, there's not really much we can sort of work with there. What's your take, Grant?
Yeah. People who pay attention to the website would know that I've got a pretty nuanced opinion on the Aboriginal question. I think, to say that our arrival was only good for them kind of depends on your value system. I mean, if you think Western civilization and all the good things that come with that is objectively, universally the best, greatest good, then you'd be right. But if you think that, if you're a true relativist and you thought that the pre-European Aboriginal way of life, which involved, a lot of things that we do not think are good, like cannibalism, starvation, kind of desperate simplicity. I mean, I quite enjoy, I don't know if you know the Twitter user Mungo Maniac, who does a lot of, or Mungo Manic.
Good
yeah.
tags.
I think I enjoy that person on Twitter because they talk about some of the historical testimony about the Indigenous and how they had no seemingly obvious mental health issues, were just kind of happily living in these kind of destitute conditions. So, there's two sides to the story. I do think that in some specific instances they were hard done by. I think overall they've gained a lot from settlement. But yeah, anyway, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But yeah, sure. I would say, I mean, and this goes to all of our podcasts generally, is that when one of our members says something, it is, or myself or even you, this is kind of our personal opinion most of the time. This podcast isn't per se the published, agreed upon position of the entire association. So just bear that in mind as well.
Yep. And listeners, if you do want to make more comments, you can do that on the YouTube upload of the podcast specifically. Just mentioning that, since there was some feedback through someone that they were a bit surprised about us asking for comments, given there are no comments on the ANA website. But you can comment on YouTube, and we'll look to address that in the next episode. Anyway, today we're going to be continuing our discussion of early history of Australia, as I said before, narrowing down our focus to the Rum Rebellion. But before we do that, I thought we could go into a poem, since it's a bit of a tradition for the podcast, although we did miss it last time in the NS one. But this is going to be a 1789 poem by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of the famous Charles Darwin. And it's called A Visit of Hope to Sydney Cove near Botany Bay. Where Sydney Cove her lucid bosom swells, courts her young navies, and the storm repels. High on a rock amid the troubled air, Hope stood sublime, and waved her golden hair. Calmed with her rosy smile the tossing deep, and with sweet accents charmed the winds to sleep. To each wild plain she stretched her snowy hand, high waving wood and sea encircled strand. Hear me, she cried, ye rising realms, record time's opening scenes and truth's unerring word. There shall broad streets their stately walls extend, the circus widen and the crescent bend. There, rayed from cities o'er the cultured land, shall bright canals and solid roads expand. There the proud arc, colossus-like, bestride yon glittering streams and bound the chasing tide. Embellished villas crown the landscape scene, farms wave with gold and orchards blush between. There shall tall spires and dome-capped towers ascend, and piers and quays their massy structures blend, while with each breeze approaching vessels glide, and northern treasures dance on every tide. Then ceased the nymph tumultuous echoes roar, and joy's loud voice was heard from shore to shore. Her graceful steps descending pressed the plain, and peace and art and labour joined her train. Yeah, so that was Erasmus Darwin's poem. It was originally published in The Voyage of Governor Phillip to Botany Bay in 1789, as I said, but it was also published later on in A Century of Australian Song, published in 1888, under the title of A Fulfilled Prophecy. So yeah, sort of another view of expanding civilization in Australia. This idea of what this country could become at a very early date, 1789.
I love it.
Sort of in a high style, similar to the Wentworth one we sometimes look at, Australasia. But yeah, that's another sort of I guess little known poem, perhaps.
Yeah, I quite the vivid imagery of embellished villas crown the landscape scene, farms wave with gold and orchards blush between. That's very, very like New South Wales core, but yeah, quite enjoyed.
Yeah, unfortunately, the tall spires and towers that ascend today, perhaps the seat of the oligarchy, and not anything better. But I'm sure we can rectify that going forward.
Yeah, without compensation too.
Yeah. Alrighty. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the main topic of the episode. The only military coup in Australian history, a key turning point, in my opinion, at least, in the early colonial period. And before we go through the events themselves, I thought it would be important to briefly recap, for context, what we covered last time, just briefly about the governors in the early stages of the colony. So all the early governors until Lachlan Macquarie arrived in 1810 were naval officers, and this led to problems in the relationship between the naval governors, who at least theoretically had absolute autocratic power in the colony, and so problems between them and the military force, which actually maintained order in the settlements. And so last time we mentioned that there was an interregnum between the departure of Governor Arthur Phillip in December 1792 and the arrival of Governor John Hunter in the September of 1795. And in that period, the New South Wales Corps, which had arrived on the Second Fleet, established itself as a ruling oligarchy with a trading monopoly in the colony. And their control over the trade in rum earned them the nickname of the Rum Corps. So now it's worth establishing just who the two main sides in the Rum Rebellion would be. But before I do that, a note on the name Rum Rebellion, for the 1808 military coup was only given in 1855 by the Quaker William Howard, who was strongly for temperance. So there is a bit of propaganda in the name itself. Being a temperance man, he wanted to sort of blame, alcohol, the devil's drink, and make that the main motivation for the coup. So, nice. Yeah, keeping that in mind, because there are some other motivations that may be just as important, if not more important. In any case, onto the two sides. So on the one side, we have the governor, William Bligh, already infamous due to being overthrown as the captain in the mutiny on the Bounty in 1789, which is quite the adventure and worth going into, as well as its own topic perhaps at some point. I don't know if you've read much on that, Grant.
I've listened to a podcast on it once. There's a good channel called the Australian Histories podcast. It's run by an elderly lady. Pretty good summary on that one. Quite enjoyed.
Yeah, so that's quite the adventure with lots of sort of miraculous journeys, and Bligh was quite heroic in how he managed to, he was cast aside off the ship with a few of his loyal men, and they made this astoundingly long journey in just the ship's boat, sailing all the way to, I believe it was the Dutch colonies in kind of Indonesia or Java or whatever it was. While the it was a bit more sex and rock and roll for the mutineers until they met a bit of a grisly demise for most of them.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but coming back to the topic of Bligh, he would arrive in New South Wales and become governor in 1806, taking over from Philip Gidley King roughly 2 years after the Castle Hill Convict Rebellion. And when he took over, there were a number of big problems in the colony that needed to be addressed. So there had been major flooding in the farmland in the Hawkesbury River District, and there was also a lack of labour and supplies due to less transportation of convicts and goods because of the resumption of the Napoleonic Wars back in Europe. And during this time, Bligh would already start to build resentment against his rule by using convict labour on his private farm, which he was claiming was like a model farm to demonstrate efficient farming practices. But at the same time, he suspended Darcy Wentworth, the surgeon at the hospital, for using invalids from the hospital on his own private farm. So it was looked at as a bit of a double standard, and that was Wentworth was also sort of a more prominent member of the colony, father of the famous William Wentworth. The main thing, however, that roused opposition was Bligh's reforms around trade and monetary payments. So he introduced new port regulations on the 4th of October 1806, and then on the 3rd of January in 1807, he made an order that all promissory notes should be drawn payable in sterling money. So now that was the official money as opposed to the unofficial currency, from where, if you recall, we get to the slang social distinction between British-born sterlings and native Australian-born currency lads and lasses. So Bligh was also unhappy with several illegal occupations and questionable leases in Sydney, which conflicted with the town plan created by previous governors. So he ordered those people illegally occupying sites to move, and at least seemed to be considering challenging a number of leases held by powerful people in the colony, including John Macarthur and George Johnston, who we will discuss in a second. Beyond this, Bligh was also known for his bad temper, and this did not mix well with his autocratic powers as governor. So upon being reminded of the need to abide by English law by the judge advocate of the time, Richard Atkins, Bligh replied, "The law, sir, damn the law. My will is the law, and woe unto the man that dares to disobey it." Yeah, that gives you a bit of an idea of his personality. Another great quote along these lines is one of his recorded responses to a leaseholder in Sydney whose lease he was revoking. He says, "Damn your laws of England. Don't talk to me of your laws of England. I will make the laws for this colony, and every wretch of you, son of a bitch, shall be governed by them, or there is your habitation." And at that point, he pointed to the jail. Yeah, so this manner of governance was not winning him many friends among the middle and upper classes of the colony. On the other hand, and I think Grant will want to get into this a little bit later when we talk about interpretations of the rebellion, Bligh has often been considered a defender of the poor, and there's a really good quote from him that demonstrates this as well. So another quote from him. He intended, at least he claimed he intended, to do justice and relieve the oppressed poor settlers, who must be the support of the country and are honester men than those who wish to keep them in order. Yeah, so this shows not just his sympathy with the morals of the yeoman farmers of the Hawkesbury region, but also his closeness to the vision of the Colonial Office, which saw New South Wales as an agrarian settlement, where convicts would be reformed by hard work on the land. Again, harkening back to the last history podcast, that vision of the Colonial Office was also influenced by the evangelical Christians in British politics, who saw the penal colony as a sort of moral reform project. Now, this vision was not shared by some of the men who had become powerful in the colony, and we'll turn to them in just a sec. But before we do that, is there anything you want to add or say about Bligh?
Yeah, without getting into the real bolts of the whole dispute, Bligh's character was real tough, and definitely, he never read, how to make friends and influence people. In one of his letters to Joseph Banks, he actually said about the Bounty expedition where this mutiny happened. He said, "Remember, my dear sir, I never failed in anything I undertook. Be assured still of my high sense of honour and dignity in the present instance. I think Providence would never have allowed me to have passed so much time amongst bad people if it had not been for some good end." So even after getting mutinied, he says, "I never failed in anything I undertook." And then another letter he'd said, "From 8 in the morning till 5 in the evening, I am confined to my office with only my secretary, for I have no other to trust to, so that the cabinet of England are not so secret as we are, and we have a wonderful good effect." He was obviously a very hardworking guy, thought very highly of himself, and he just didn't muck around, as we'll get to when the issues with Macarthur started with him.
Yep, righto. Do you want me to keep going then?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'll read. I've got some other notes as well, but I think they're more relevant to the discussion in a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. So going back to the two sides, we've covered Bligh. On the other side, as has been mentioned a couple of times now, Macarthur and Johnston. And this is the side that initiated the coup. So John Macarthur, Major George Johnston. Macarthur was a wealthy landowner, businessman, former military officer, while George Johnston was, at this point, the commander of the New South Wales Corps. So again, back in our last episode, Johnston was the man who acted decisively to end the Castle Hill convict rebellion in 1804, kind of tricking the leaders of the convicts that he's going to sort of negotiate under a banner of truce, and then just capturing them, and the convicts fell apart without their leadership.
Art of war.
Yep, art of war stuff. I see you've added something here. Also arrested in 1800 for refusing a general court-martial under Governor Hunter in the colony on a charge of forcing spirits on a sergeant as part of his pay and at an improper price. Yeah, so perhaps not the most honest man.
Yeah. Yeah, I was in Doc Everett's book, which we'll talk about a bit more in a little bit. There's quite a bit of a description of how George was manipulating even the soldiers' pay with rum and cigarettes and like just weird kind of. It was a real barter economy for a bit there, and he definitely took advantage of it because, when it's currency, you can't, or sterling, it's a dollar figure. You can't argue about it. But if you have a kind of people that are being employed on a quantity of rum and an amount of tobacco and an amount of flour and sugar and stuff, you can really manipulate and kind of distort people's, I suppose, income for your own benefit. But anyway, that's what that was what Governor Hunter was trying to rein in. But yeah, we'll touch on Hunter again in a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So these guys, officers or former officers in the case of Macarthur, were involved in business and trade. So a little background context on that. So in spite of official instructions from the first governor, Arthur Phillip, ships were already being built in Australia due to the rise of a sealing industry in the 1790s. So obviously here we're kind of getting a bit of a conflict of vision already between, the idea of this is just going to be a penal colony, right, with full of convicts. And so we probably don't want extra ships that they can escape on. And then the people that are actually trying to build a life here and are like, well, we kind of want to get into business and, create some industries and stuff. So Governor King would encourage the sealing industry and some of the other commercial efforts. He also collaborated in the ideas of developing Sydney as more of a trading and merchant town. Much of the land settled in New South Wales was held by right of naked possession alone, but theoretically the Crown had rights to all the land, so that's quite important to remember. Now, we should note that the development of Sydney along the lines of commerce was not the vision of the Colonial Office, and Bligh would not be so accommodating as King. But to come back to the officers and their business interests, as we mentioned, rum was used for barter and pay, sometimes in manipulative ways, as with George Johnston. And this is basically because in the early period of the colony, the official currency was in short supply. And because the officers of the New South Wales Corps controlled the rum trade, and that's why the Corps became nicknamed the Rum Corps, they did hold quite a lot of power through this sort of mechanism of the barter. Now, one of the former officers, John Macarthur, also became one of the biggest owners of sheep in the colony. So it wasn't just about rum for these guys. But again, it wasn't free of corruption either, because he was given very favourable grants of land due to the military having that controlling influence, controlling power between the governors in that interregnum after Arthur Phillip left. And this made him one of the big pioneers of Australian pastoralism with regard to sheep, alongside one of the early churchmen of the colony, Samuel Marsden. Yeah, so Marsden and Macarthur are really the two big names when it comes to sheep and pastoralism in that early period. Yeah, so the officers, when it comes to the tension with the governors, they challenged them in the past. In 1801, during Philip Gidley King's governorship, Macarthur promoted a boycott of Government House among the officers of the New South Wales Corps. And that was really leveraging the strong social influence of the officer class. Because obviously, on one hand, you've got the convicts and you're not necessarily going to be inviting, the convicts over for dinner and and the promiscuous women and stuff to government house, right? So you kind of restricted to, the few free settlers and then like the officers. So that was actually quite quite effective to have those social boycotts. And the other mechanism that the officers had to exercise their power was their control over the courts, since they were most often the only ones eligible, to sit as members of the court. To get into the ideology of these guys, because this is actually quite interesting, and before I started looking into this, I didn't really understand this angle at all. But one of the main influences on the actions of the officers was their adoption of the Whig ideals of freedom. So those ideals which were the justification for the overthrow of King James II in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and which were also appealed to by the American revolutionaries. And just for those who may be unfamiliar with the term, the Whigs, which is spelled Whigs, were one of the political parties in the parliaments back in Great Britain. They were basically a liberal party. They opposed absolute monarchy, Catholicism, and they supported parliamentary government, constitutional monarchy, and Protestant supremacy. So could have different views on that, but that's what they were, and that's kind of the way the influence was running. George Johnston, having served in the American Civil War on the side of the British, fighting in New York and Halifax in 1777 to 1778. There's some speculation he may have been influenced by some of the ideas of Thomas Paine as well, when it came to the need for revolutions in order to secure property rights and individual liberty. And this was especially relevant to that issue of Bligh's threats to the leases in Sydney. Yeah, certainly Macarthur would later argue after the coup, based on arguments made by Jeremy Bentham in his writing on Australia, a plea for the Constitution, that the government's authority over the free settlers was actually illegal according to English law. Yeah, anything you want to add on these guys, Grant? Because I probably, when I wrote these notes, put Macarthur and Johnston in a bit of more of a positive light, like they're these liberal idealists or whatever. But I thought it was good to touch on the political ideology in this podcast. So
yeah, look, I think it's funny. This is like the ultimate inside me there's two wolves moment, because on the one hand, like I would almost be considered like a massive Whig, a massive Roundhead, like if me and King Charles Stuart were put into a room together, like only one of us were getting out alive. But at the same time, I think that Macarthur and, the kind of leading members of the New South Wales Corps would only really have purportedly been kind of liberals, because they were kind of using that as a political justification for what I think is just kind of abhorrent, corrupt oligarchy. I think it goes with mentioning at this point of where we're up to in the story that the issue with the Rum Rebellion between Bligh and Macarthur and the New South Wales Corps is actually not the first dispute. I mean, we briefly touched on before how there'd been some issues with former governors like Governor King and Governor Hunter and Governor Phillip. There was a time when Governor Hunter was actually trying to prosecute the New South Wales Corps, not just because they were in control of the rum trade, but because they were in charge of the ships, in charge of trade. He sent an appeal letter back to the Crown in the United Kingdom and noted that there'd been a price difference or price manipulation to the tune of 700% between the landing costs and the price of sale of goods to the public. So they were taking a 700% cut off the top of products being imported to the colony. And the other thing worth mentioning is, the great Percy Stevenson, peace and blessings be upon him, in Our Story in 15 Decades, makes note of the fact that Macarthur, being a very well-connected, kind of, he's the one percenter, to use today's terms, went to the UK and got a land grant for 5,000 acres from Lord Camden, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, basically for nothing, just called in a little favour. And that 5,000 acres of land came much to the indignation and the envy of the other settlers who had gone there without any ropes to pull in his favour. And he really leveraged that premium land he was given to build a lot of his wealth on top of convict labour, which another funny story is when Governor John Hunter was in power, there was a rule that only 2 indentured convict labourers were allowed for personal use for the settlers and the officers. However, Macarthur demanded 100 instead of 2.
Yeah.
And so
pretty hard done by too,
he was very hard done by. And among that as well, Macarthur in his earlier history before the Rum Rebellion was instrumental in a conspiracy with other members of the New South Wales Corps. In 1796, they performed a home invasion effectively on a fellow named Bourne, who had become obnoxious to the officers and their fellow rum traffickers, as Doc Evatt writes in his book, The Rum Rebellion. The attack was so unprovoked that the town became alarmed, and there was a general demand that the wrongdoers should be punished. However, the chief surgeon, Balmain, who was the civil magistrate, when seeking to interrogate Bourne, the victim was so frightened of the military, who allegedly threatened to kill his wife, was unwilling to give testimony. So the attempt to prosecute Macarthur and some of the Corps failed because it wouldn't stand up to law for fear of further repercussions. So there was also the recalling of earlier governors. So Governor Hunter and King were both heavily defamed and besieged by Macarthur and the New South Wales Corps because they were also trying to, flex their autocratic power to rein in this kind of price manipulation, the kind of moral decadence that was going on in the colony. Percy Stevenson again writes, the military officers of the New South Wales Corps were free to devote their main energies to getting rich, acquiring land, robbing the government, and intriguing against the naval governors Hunter and Bligh. So you can tell I have a strong opinion on the New South Wales Corps and Macarthur. Macarthur is almost certainly in the deepest circle of hell. Reverend John Dunmore Lang writes that a trade began with the settlers and lower orders of the people, the rum trade, the effects of which will be long felt. And it was the ruin of many, an industrious people, the destruction of all moral order. And this man, he's talking about Macarthur.
Yeah.
And this man, Macarthur, so strenuous an advocate for such an order and good management, was one of the most extensive dealers in the colony of rum. And to this unfortunate system, founded upon the ruins of all decency and civil order, are all misfortunes and expenses in the colony. So there's a lot of, before you really get into the Rum Rebellion, and this is something that, Doc Evatt notes in his book, it's so important to understand that Macarthur and the New South Wales Corps had already been at loggerheads with previous magistrates or judge advocates and governors, because to most governors, they're kind of an insidious, rum trafficking, price manipulating, corrupt bunch that not only were dealing in goods unfairly, but were also running brothels and encouraging people to get boozed up and all the rest of it. Philip Gidley King, so the third governor of New South Wales, noted in a letter to the Crown that Macarthur, in his 11 years in the colony, had made a large fortune, helping his brother officers make small ones, mostly at the public expense. and sowing discord and strife. And these points I've brought home to him are such that, if properly investigated, must certainly occasion his quitting the New South Wales Corps and the Army. Experience has convinced every man in this colony that there are no resources which art, cunning, impudence, and a pair of basilic eyes can afford, and he does not put into practice to obtain any point he undertakes. It is to these odds and the independence of his fortune that I have to oppose my exertions for the tranquillity of this colony, the welfare of the public service, and my own reputation, had I allowed Captain Macarthur to direct the concerns of this colony, and Colonel Patterson, had allowed him to command the regiment. This perturber would have been so far remained in silence as first to turn the surrender to his own advantage, but not without scenting an opportunity to throw the colony into that confusion he has so lately failed in doing. So, so Philip King was neck and neck with Macarthur. They were quite frankly at each other's throats. And there's a lot more depth to that kind of a story, but we're here to talk about the Rum Rebellion. So I think, having introduced Macarthur and George, it's pretty clear that there was a lot of issues between them and the colonial government long before Bligh showed up. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah, look, maybe this is showing my hand a little bit too much, but I'm personally not that surprised to find liberalism and abhorrent oligarchic corruption hand in hand. But perhaps, perhaps that's my autocratic love coming out.
Bias detected, but yeah. Look, if they couldn't have made the position worse for themselves, honestly. Like, that's the clearest bloody evidence for some of the failures of a liberal kind of system. But it really wasn't a kind of a liberal system. Like, it was an autocracy.
It was
just
in theory an autocracy.
Yeah, it's just the autocrat's been staunched by the oligarchs. So anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so since we've gone through the background, we may as well run through the actual events of the rebellion, really a military coup, and then perhaps we can discuss some interpretations of the event as well and its significance. So the Rum Rebellion, apart from growing conflict between the governor, the rich landowners, the officer class, the real spark that set off the rebellion was when a convict stowed away on one of Macarthur's schooners, the Parramatta, in June of 1807. And when the ship returned in December of that year, the bond that was held to ensure that ship owners did not help convicts to escape the colony was deemed forfeit. So now this put Bligh and Macarthur on direct collision course, more so than they had already collided, with Bligh having Richard Atkins, the judge advocate of the colony, issue an order for Macarthur to appear before the court. Macarthur disobeyed this, and so he was arrested and bailed. Summoned to court again on the 25th of January 1808. Macarthur disobeyed again with the support of the officers who were on the court. So as I mentioned earlier, the officers were really the ones who had a lot of control over the courts. So Macarthur was sort of using that card. Now, this led to Bligh accusing these officers of effectively mutinying against the government, and so Bligh now summons Major George Johnston to deal with them. But Johnston doesn't turn up, giving the excuse that he's ill, right? I remember something crashed, his gig crashed or something. Basically, dog ate my homework type stuff. The next day, 26th of January 1808, Bligh once again ordered that Macarthur be arrested, and so he was put in jail. He also ordered the officers of the New South Wales Court to return court documents, which they held. The officers gave a counter demand that a new judge advocate replace Richard Atkins and that Macarthur be released on bail. So in response to this, Bligh again summoned the officers, including Johnston, and he told Johnston that he considered the actions of the military to be effectively treason. Instead of complying with Bligh's orders at this point, Johnston went to Macarthur, freed him, and together they created a petition to depose Bligh, which would eventually be signed by most of the influential men of the colony, although there is some dispute as to whether they signed, that is, the influential men of the colony signed the petition before the coup or after the fact. In my opinion, probably going to be after the fact, judging from how Johnston and Macarthur operated. But in any case, on 6 p.m. of the 26th, the New South Wales Corps marched to Government House with full band and colours and arrested Bligh. Famously, Australia's first political cartoon would come out soon after the event, depicting Bligh as hiding under a bed, although Bligh would maintain that he was actually destroying documents. You want to take over for this bit, Grant?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the classic painting cartoon of Bligh getting pulled out from under his bed. Yeah, Doc Evatt in his book on the Rum Rebellion, basically looking at the authorities and looking at the early, because Macarthur was put on trial for this whole fiasco after Governor Macquarie took over. And in these early trials, they went through the whole event in quite a bit of detail. And there was no reference to Bligh actually being under his bed or hiding under his bed. Doc Evatt reckons it's a complete fabrication. Basically, the slander against Bligh started earlier than this with a bunch of little kind of poems, slam poetry in the local publications, kind of defaming him. And they think that this is, well, Doc Evatt reckons this is an extension of that, and that he wasn't, in fact, under his bed. But yeah,
what do you know? Control over the papers and the news is important.
Indeed.
When
Very
engaging
powerful
in political shenanigans.
Yeah.
So in any case, as we said, the result of the coup would be that Johnson would take control of the colony as Lieutenant Colonel and appoint a new judge advocate. In the end, as you mentioned, Grant, they were both summoned to face the courts back in England. But from memory, and I haven't really looked at the aftermath as much as the event itself, they really only got slaps on the wrist, and would come back and basically have a pretty good go of things. Macarthur would still be rich and powerful, and Johnson, I believe, similar but less so. So most importantly, the next man to be governor after the coup, the taking over as Lieutenant Colonel by Johnston, next man would be a military man, very competent, known as the father of Australia, and that would be Lachlan Macquarie. But that's really the event itself. Should we go on to some interpretations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just before we do that,
Yep.
Yeah, there was a couple of other bits of commentary that for the sake of posterity, we should probably note as well. So Doc Evatt, in his commentary on this period in history, he said that Bligh's dictatorship was being exercised in favour of the agriculturalists and the poor settlers against the wealthy traffickers and monopolists. He then quotes J.M. Abbott's book, in which it was stated the officers of the New South Wales Corps had come to regard their military duties as being very much subordinate to the advancement of their private interests. They traded and trafficked, they speculated in land, and they dealt in spirits. Some of them actually owned in Sydney public houses and inns that were no better than brothels, and that Captain Bligh was determined to thwart the scheme of these powerful factions. In his own way, he was a just man and had high ideals as to the proper discharge of his duties. Being a determined man, however, of choleric habit and despotic inclination, his attitude towards those whom he saw trying to benefit themselves unfairly at the cost of the public welfare was, to put it in his own way, he'd be damned if they should. So, the great story of Bligh was, in my opinion, he had the right idea, had the right moral standard, but was not versed in the art of war and attacked when his opponent was strong. Because I think he had illusions of his own authority and his own ability to wage war against this deeply entrenched oligarchy in the colony, which totally outflanked him.
Perhaps there are some lessons for us today in that as well, when we're facing our own deeply entrenched oligarchic system.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's like if we were to throw onto an interpretation of the event, I mean, I think that's that's probably the big one from Doc Evatt, really, is if you were to summarize the event, this is the story of a noble governor, Bligh, following from the tail of a couple of other governors who had also been chewed up and spat out by Macarthur and his cronies. And Bligh was just kind of very brave and also foolhardy with his attempt to quash the oligarchy. And he suffered the full price for it, I suppose.
Yeah, perhaps you could, just for the listeners who don't know, say in a sentence or two who Doc Evatt, or Herbert Vere Evatt, actually was.
So Doc Evatt, he was a member of the Labor Party in the federal parliament around World War II. After the Second World War, he served on the High Court. He was also the first president of the United Nations. He was a staunch kind of Australian nationalist Labor man, also a history buff. He was quite interested in this period of our history. So yeah, that's Doc Evatt. If you didn't know him, he's one of the.
He drafted the Human Rights Declaration or something, didn't he?
Yeah, so he helped with the Refugee Convention. That's right.
Very base stuff.
Yeah. See, that's the funny thing, right? He was so formative in the UN and the Refugee Convention, whilst at the same time unapologetically asserting the principle of a white Australia. And I touch on this in an article I wrote on the website not long ago, just about, the Refugee Convention, when it was drafted, envisaged you helping your neighbour, not helping country shoppers who travel through half a dozen safe countries to come knocking on your door. So anyway, that's another subject for another day. But yeah, Doc Evatt is quite an interesting figure. He tried to actually become Prime Minister, but because he was afraid of flying, he went on a ship, or might have been even a submarine at the end of World War II, back to Australia after being involved in the peace treaty with Japan. And whilst he was in that position, Ben Chifley managed to sweep in and take the Prime Ministership, which pissed a few people off in the Labor Party because they thought that Doc Evatt was destined to be the leader of the Labor Party, but Ben Chifley took it. But anyway, more deep lore for you.
There we go. Now fans will know who Doc Evatt is.
Yeah.
Anyway, on my side of the story, coming back to the Rum Rebellion, I looked a bit more at William Wentworth's take on it. And he's a character that's probably worth looking at on his own at some point, but he was one of the most influential currency lads in the early stages of the colony of New South Wales. His take was much more favourable towards the officers, probably because he broadly shared their sort of the Whig appeals that they sort of appealed to. His argument was that the lack of an elected assembly that represented the interests of the free settlers was what allowed Bligh's rule to become tyrannical and let him strip the settlers of their inherited rights and privileges. And so I'll just read a couple of quotes from his book, A Statistical, Historical and Political Description of the Colony of New South Wales and its Dependent Settlements in Van Diemen's Land. A very sort of, 19th century style title. Yeah. So quote, or I would quote if I hadn't just skipped away from my quote. Here it is. Dreading the resentment of the people whom he had so often and so wantonly oppressed, and having on his back that uniform, which was never so dishonoured before, Bligh skulked under a servant's bed in an obscure chamber of his house, but was at length discovered in this disgraceful hole and conducted, pale, trembling, and covered with flu, before the officer who had commanded his arrest. Nor could this gentleman's repeated assurances that no violence should be offered his person convince him for a considerable time that his life was in safety from the vengeance of the populace. So conscious was he of the enormity of his conduct and of the justice of an immediate and exemplary retaliation. So
you can tell which side he's on.
Slightly propagandistic description of him from Wentworth here. But going back to Wentworth, a little more political in this case. He says, "This instance of tyranny I am willing to allow was an aggravated one, and such as it is hoped for the honour of our species would be rarely repeated. That it has occurred, however, is sufficient to demonstrate the impropriety of confiding unlimited power to an individual in future. The mere possession of such vast authority is calculated to vitiate the heart and to engender tyranny. Nor are examples wanting in history of persons who, though models of virtue and moderation in private stations, yet became the most bloody and atrocious tyrants on their elevation to supreme power. So great indeed is the fallibility of human nature that the very best of us are apt to deviate from that just mean in the adherence to which consists virtue. All governments, therefore, should provide against this capital defect." So we can really hear here clearly the Whig ideals. He's absolutely opposed to autocratic government, basically puts all the blame for the coup onto Bligh. And although later on in this book, he has much nicer things to say about Bligh's next official successor, which is Macquarie. But in relation to the form of government, he's implacable in demanding representation. And obviously he would be, very influential in getting a legislative council established and so on. But what's your take on that, Grant?
Yeah, look.
Putting aside the propaganda, which is quite clear in the first.
Of course, yeah. No, look.
First quote.
Strong agree, like from an ideological point of view. Like that's the ultimate irony of this, because I'll get into my feelings on William Wentworth in a second. But like as a man, I do think like what we see here is a continuation of Macarthur's propaganda, that hiding behind the veil of the liberty of the English subject and the need to restrain, the fallible human nature, which has autocratic power and abuse of power and all of that. Like that, those are all really good points on one hand, but the real motive for Macarthur and the core spreading that message about Bligh being this tyrant and blah, 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 is that they're really just trying to protect their own interests, like their own financial corrupt interests in the colony. Bligh wasn't going around, brutally price gouging peasant farmers, wasn't seizing their land. He was doing what was in the interests of the common settler of the colony, and that was not in the interest of the New South Wales Corps. So, but yeah, I think Wentworth, the other irony about this as well, and talking about representation and all the rest of it, and how we shouldn't have this oligarchy or this too much autocracy, is he later went on to try and advocate for a peerage system. And like in the Legislative Council in New South Wales, it's definitely a subject for another day. But, William Wentworth he swings all over the spectrum. Like he's truly the Giga Chad, like doesn't believe in logical or ideological consistency. Like he just does whatever he thinks suits him most in the moment. Because William Wentworth, on the one hand, he created the Patriotic League, which you rightly said advocated for the early Parliament of New South Wales. And then he also had some choice words about the virtues of the British race and its place in the world and our high form of civilization and all the rest of it. But then also, when convict labour began to dry up, William Wentworth was a massive advocate for getting Pacific Island coolie labour, and was a founding member of the one of these, almost the precursor to the Australian Business Council in Sydney, kind of advocating for cheap foreign labour, which at the time the autocratic governors were putting up resistance to. So yeah, Wentworth as well, not a fan because of that, the coloured labour thing, the peerage system thing, which I'm also not a fan of.
Yeah, I could get behind that.
Yeah.
As long as I become a lord.
Of course. As long as you're the peer, it's all good.
Yeah.
Where, Daniel Delaney, the lawyer from Goulburn, who was like William Wentworth's like number one enemy, wrote in his Bunyip Aristocracy the belief in the meritocracy, there'll be an aristocracy of free men that show, the greatest virtues and blah, 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 blah. So like it opened up there was a whole wave of political discussion on that. So anyway, yes. So his interpretation is cringe, is the long and short of it from my perspective. But that's because I think he's just gobbled up. History is written by the victors, right? And Macarthur and the New South Wales Corps were absolutely the victors. When young William Wentworth grew up later on, I think he just gobbled up all of Macarthur's propaganda that was used to justify deposing Bligh, who did nothing wrong. But anyway, that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Look, I kind of come at it from the angle of you need to, I guess, synthesize the best of both the autocratic power side of things and the representation side of things. And I think you can find that probably in Hegel's political theory and some of these sort of things. But I mean, the system that Hegel described was not that far from the English system, really. And he had this stupid German excuse for why, the English suck or whatever. But, much of English history has had a very, a belief in a strong executive, as part of the balance, the balance of powers.
Yeah,
You've got the representation, but you have the strong executive as well, which, ironically is probably best represented in the American system today with the powers of the president, which is kind of like an elective monarchy almost. But
yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, Australia is a funny one because we do have the monarch, but in a kind of symbolic role and overseas in Great Britain. So
yeah, the constitutional lawyers call it the Washminster system. We have this perfect blend between an American-style constitutionally entrenched separation of powers, whilst also benefiting from having a less politically motivated executive crown at the top of the rank. So yeah, I am a strong advocate for the Australian constitutional system. But the critique always is, and it's consistent with any model of government, that the government and the form of civilization is only as good as the average link in the chain, right? If you have a very decadent, kind of rootless population, doesn't matter if you have a very noble form of government, it will still fail. Look at the French Revolution. It's you can have a somewhat noble monarchy, but if your average population has just become this kind of degenerate cesspool, they will just kill them. Look at Russia, look at anywhere else. All political systems and the model of government, I think, are ultimately subservient to the quality of the population in general. But yeah, that's...
I mean, I think in one of the previous podcasts, when we were reading this article from John Lawson of the National Observer and talking about kind of potential solutions to this and kind of blends of the autocracy and the representation, you might be able to adjust to this with, limiting the franchise in some way or something like that, which I think is probably a good move if you're going to keep, a more democratic Australian style system, but touch it up a little bit so that you're not having the absolute dregs of society having an equal say.
Yeah It's really look, it's so hard, this subject, because on the one hand, it sounds really good to cut out people without children, people who don't hold property, all the rest of it. But then at the same time, if you look at what led to getting the universal franchise, it was because land barons had a disproportionate amount of power, and that was actually leading to a more general, I suppose, detriment to the country, because they weren't letting up their holdings in their land. They weren't dividing it. It became very hard. In the 1880s, 1890s, what was called the land boom period in Victoria and New South Wales, it was almost equivalent to today, in terms of how difficult it was to actually acquire your own property and to, with that, acquire all the full rights of voting and all the rest of it. So there's definitely, I can see arguments for both sides. It's very difficult. I think the example, though, of like the meth junkie having a vote and the businessman having one vote is pretty clear cut. Like there needs to be more qualifications for voting. I would definitely endorse a vote basis on the number of members of the household, that the father would get a vote, for one for his wife and one for each child he has, which is kind of more similar to the Roman system, the Roman Republic system. The land holding one is a bit contentious because you do always have, we're probably at a point now where there is enough blocks of land in this country individually that you wouldn't have that same land baron vote risk that we did in the old days, but you can definitely see the risks with going that way. But yeah, I do agree with Lawson's general vibe that there's definitely a form of a constitutional monarchy parliamentarian system with a more restricted franchise, where the franchise is decided by how much stake you have in the future of the country. Like that's definitely very noble as an objective. You just need to get the balance right so it's not abused.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty good, solid discussion of the event. I mean, if anyone wants to hear any other specific takes from us, they could always leave a comment. But you had a quote I think you wanted to end with. I'm not sure if you've said it yet. The Percy Stevenson one.
Oh yeah. So Percy Stevenson says in his brief survey of Australian history that the deposition of Governor Bligh was an act of insurrection, rebellion, revolution, and sedition by, so quote, the best families of New South Wales. And it all ends with the benevolent dictatorship of Governor Lachlan Macquarie, a patriarchal Highland chieftain who gives Australia the best one-man government ever known. That is also staunch and Scottish-pilled. I'm a big supporter of Lachlan Macquarie. There's definitely a podcast in even talking about Macquarie and some of the things he did for the colony. And he's a very impressive character as well, even outside of just what he did for New South Wales, like his role in the American Civil War and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think that should pretty much wrap up this episode. There's definitely going to be some Macarthur apologists out there, and may the earth swallow them up. May they have a good rest. But it's interesting. Like it is really interesting. I mean, even just to very quickly, I know we're running out of time.
Oh, go ahead.
To very quickly make this relevant to today. In today's day and age, there is also a very entrenched financial oligarchy which has this country by the undies. Whether it be the New South Wales core speculating on goods and prices and increasing prices by 700% and, basically having the crown in a position of servitude. I think that's very much the case today. The combined forces of international finance capital and the media and, particular ethnic groups which have disproportionate lobbying power to their proportion of the population. There is undoubtedly a similar oligarchy. However, they have done so well at entrenching themselves that there's actually no meaningful opposition. I mean, at least Bligh could have a bit of a throwdown before getting defeated. It's pretty sad, but it also goes to show the tactical decisions you have to make when faced with such an oligarchy. Bligh was very hard-headed, very brave. He had the martyr mindset. He was ready to go hard, even when he was outnumbered, outflanked on all sides, completely tactically outmaneuvered and outgunned, and he was destroyed by that. You wonder if, he was benefited with a copy of The Art of War, how he might have reassessed his situation, played a longer strategy to whittle away at Macarthur's influence in the colony, make more targeted, more strategic victories. Maybe, there's different ways this could have panned out. Obviously, Governor Macquarie, being a soldier, had that initial higher amount of prestige, brought his own troops with him, and was really able to smash this New South Wales Corps with an equal force. Bligh had a smaller force and needed to act in a far more tactical manner, which I think is relevant to us as well. Like, if the ANA and nationalists more generally, we are facing, our political beliefs and policies are basically the end of finance, international finance, capital, globalization, mass immigration, all the rest of it, which they are entirely benefiting from, making huge gains from. So we need to be tactical as well and realize, fight when the enemy is weak. If the enemy is not weak, evade him, build your own resources, sum up your own troops, and become equipped for the battle before entering it. And having your logistics and all that sorted out is part of the institution that is the ANA, to equip people and create that force that will eventually be able to offer a challenge to the entrenched oligarchy, which currently pillages this country, much like the New South Wales Corps did in these days.
Inspiring stuff. Yeah, I'm definitely behind the strategy. We are preparing initiatives. We are doing things behind the scenes as well for all the naysayers out there. But yeah, we don't want to attack head on, right? A numerically superior foe.
Yeah,
so we do have to play the not literally, but metaphorically, the guerrilla warfare type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, let's close it up. Let us know, listeners, in the comments what topics you'd like to hear about from us, or if there's a particular period of topic in Australian history you'd like us to do a show on. We're also going to make, as I said before, more of an effort to respond to any serious comments in our next episode. As always, I'd encourage all our supporters in the audience to make sure you like and subscribe and share our content far and wide. And we'd love to share this podcast with all good, solid Australian men. If you want to reach out, you can always find us at oznatives.org.
In South Australia I was born, heave away, all away. South Australia is my home, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. Now as I walked out one morning fair, heave away, all away. 'Twas there I met Miss Nancy Blair, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all away. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. I shook her up, I shook her down, heave away, all away. I shook her round and round the town, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all away. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. There's just one thing that grieves my mind, heave away, all away. That's leaving Nancy Blair behind, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all away. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. And when we're walloping off Cape Horn, heave away, all the way. You'll wish to God you'd never been born, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. I wish I was on Australia's strand, heave away, all the way. With a bottle of whiskey in me hand, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia.